The venue owner called me on a Wednesday morning and said, "Ms. Harrington, I just want to confirm that you still want to proceed with the June booking, because I received a cancellation request yesterday from someone identifying herself as the mother of the groom." And I said, "Thank you so much for calling me directly, Sandra." And Sandra said, "Well, the contract is in your name, so any changes have to come from you." And I said, "I know." And I said, "Please do not cancel anything." And Sandra said, "Of course." And I said, "Actually, Sandra, I have one more request." And she said, "Anything." And I said, "I'd like you to send me a written record of the cancellation attempt, including the name and contact information the caller provided." And Sandra paused for 1 second and said, "I can do that." And I said, "Thank you." And I hung up and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about my mother-in-law, Vivian. And I thought about the 3 months she had spent telling my fiancé, James, that she supported our wedding completely. And I thought about the conversation I was going to have with James that evening. And I decided I was going to wait until I had Sandra's email in my inbox before I said a single word to anyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. And if you are new here, today's story is one where the most important thing that happens is a phone call I did not make but received. And everything after that call is just me deciding what to do with information I was given by someone who had no idea she was handing me the most important piece of evidence I needed. So stay with me because the sequence matters. My name is Camille Harrington, and I am 31 years old, and I got married 7 months ago to James Whitfield. And the wedding was genuinely one of the best days of my life. But the 4 months leading up to it included my mother-in-law, Vivian, attempting to cancel our venue booking without my knowledge or consent, while simultaneously telling everyone in the family that she fully supported the marriage. And I want to walk you through exactly how that played out, because the gap between what Vivian said and what Vivian did is the entire story. Vivian had made her feelings about me clear before the engagement, though never directly, always through the specific language of mild concern. She would say things like, "James is very independent, you know, and I just want to make sure he's thought this through, and I want him to be happy." All of which were technically benign statements that collectively communicated something less benign. And when James proposed and I said yes and we started planning, Vivian shifted into a mode I can only describe as performative support, meaning she attended the engagement party with a smile. She asked about floral arrangements with apparent interest. She offered to help address invitations, and she said at a family dinner approximately 8 weeks before the venue call that she was so glad James had found someone who made him happy, and James had squeezed my hand under the table and I had squeezed back and I had thought something was still off, even though I could not have pointed to specific evidence of it. The venue was a restored farmhouse about 40 minutes outside the city, and I had found it and booked it myself. The contract was entirely in my name. I had paid the deposit from my own account, and the only reason Vivian even knew the name of the venue was because James had mentioned it at a family dinner several months earlier in conversation. And I had not thought anything of that mention at the time, because why would I? We were engaged, families share information, and I had no reason to believe that Vivian was paying attention to the venue name specifically as operational information she intended to act on. Sandra's email arrived 40 minutes after our phone call, and it included a time-stamped record of the call Vivian had made the previous afternoon and the name she had given, which was Mrs. Vivian Whitfield, mother of James Whitfield, the groom, and it included the reason Vivian had cited for requesting the cancellation, which was that the wedding had been called off by mutual agreement and the booking was no longer needed. And I read that reason twice, and I sat with the specific deliberateness of it, because called off by mutual agreement was not a vague or accidental misrepresentation. It was a constructed lie intended to sound credible to a venue coordinator. And I saved the email to 2 separate places, and I printed a copy, and I put it in a folder, and I went about the rest of my Wednesday. I did not tell James that evening, and I want to explain this choice, because I think it is the most important decision in the story, which is that I needed to be certain before I brought this to James that what I had was complete and unambiguous, not because I doubted Sandra's account, which was clear and documented, but because I knew from everything I understood about James and his relationship with his mother that this conversation when it happened, was going to require him to reckon with something significant about someone he loved, and I did not want to hand him a partial picture and ask him to build a conclusion from it. I wanted to hand him the complete picture at once, so that the conclusion was unavoidable rather than arguable. I waited 4 days, which was long enough to receive Sandra's written confirmation and to have a brief, professional, unemotional conversation with Sandra directly about the protocol for future contact from anyone other than me regarding our booking. And on Sunday evening, I sat down with James and I said, I need to show you something, and I put Sandra's email on the table in front of him, and I said, read this completely before you say anything. And James read it, and I watched his face move through several things in sequence. Confusion first, then a specific kind of focused attention that I recognized as him rereading to make sure he understood correctly. And then something quieter and harder that I did not have a word for in the moment, but that I think was the specific pain of recognizing an action you cannot excuse in someone you love. He said, this is my mother's name, and I said yes. And he said, she called the venue and said, we called it off, and I said yes. And he said, and I said 4 days ago, and he said, you've known for 4 days. And I said, I wanted to have the documentation complete before I told you. And he said, Camille, and I said, James, I need you to understand what she did. She didn't make an inquiry. She didn't ask questions. She provided a false reason for cancellation and asked them to proceed. If Sandra hadn't called me to verify, I would not have known until significantly closer to the date. And James sat with that for a long time, and then he said, I need to call her, and I said, I think that's right. And he said, what do you want to happen? And I said, I want her to tell you the truth about why she did it, because I think you deserve to hear that from her, directly. James called Vivian that evening from our living room, and I sat nearby, and I heard one side of a conversation that went on for almost an hour, and the version Vivian offered initially was that she had been worried the wedding was moving too fast, and she had simply tried to buy some time. And James said, Mom, you told the venue we had mutually called it off. That's not buying time. And Vivian said I panicked. And James said you panicked and lied to a vendor and tried to cancel a contract in someone else's name. And there was a long pause on the phone. And then Vivian said, I just want what's best for you. And James said, I need you to hear me clearly. Camille is what's best for me. And if you do something like this again, you will not be at this wedding. And the silence on the other end of that phone was the longest I have heard from Vivian in the 18 months I have known her. Vivian came to the wedding. She sat in the front row. She cried during the vows, and I believe those tears were real because I think Vivian is a complicated person who genuinely loves her son and also genuinely could not accept that her love for him did not give her the right to override his choices. And I shook her hand at the reception, and I said, I'm glad you're here, Vivian, and I meant it. Not because I had forgotten what she did, but because I had already decided before the wedding that I was not going to carry her worst moment into my best one. And the venue booking confirmation sat in a folder at home, and the wedding happened exactly as planned, and Sandra, when I thanked her after the wedding, said she had never had anything like this happen before, and I said, I hope you never do again.